What is going on, everybody? Welcome to a new series. This series is going to be kind of like the quick tip series, but it is all going to revolve around bossing and how you should gear for certain bosses. I try to do videos on questions that I see a lot or that I get personally a lot. And one of those questions for a lot of different bosses is, what's best in slot here? What should I use? How should I do this? So I thought that this would be a good idea to give people a look at a cheap setup for a boss that you can absolutely use and will work, as well as the best in slot variant. So for this series, I thought it would be good to start off with General Ghrazi, who is the Bandos God Wars dungeon boss, because it is a boss that a lot of newer PVMers really start to get into as they break into the PVM scene once their account gets ready. So we're going to go ahead and start with General Ghrazi, and we're going to start off with best in slot setups. So up on the screen right now, we have our best in slot tank setup. Obviously, it's going to be expensive because it is best in slot. Total gear cost for this setup is going to be 1.115 billion GP. So let's get into the explanation of this setup. So obviously, I am using the Justiciar helmet, plate body, and legs, which provide a set effect. This set effect always reduces incoming combat damage by a certain percentage. And this percentage is based off of your defense bonus for the attack style that is being used. For example, the stab on this setup is plus 453. So we would actually divide that by 3000, which is the formula, which would give us a total damage reduction of 15%. Now, what's great about this is it actually stacks with the Elysian Spirit Shield, which has a 70% chance of reducing the damage the player receives by 25%. So on average, that's about a 17.5% overall damage reduction from the Elysian Spirit Shield. So basically, we're reducing about 32% damage from all sources when we're using the Justiciar paired with the Elysian Spirit Shield. Now, at the time of this video, the Elysian Spirit Shield is around 940 mil or so, and obviously not everyone can afford that. It's much more likely that people can afford everything else in this setup, but not the Elysian, so you could easily swap that out with something like a Dragonfire Shield, which is pretty cheap nowadays. As for the rest of the gear setup, it's not true best in slot because I have a Fire Cape here, which obviously would be Infernal Cape, but I don't have one of those yet, so just imagine that's an Infernal Cape if you have one. We're also going to be using the Blood Fury Amulet, which gives you that passive healing effect. So as a tank, that is really nice for when you do hit, if you can proc that effect. The Rada's Blessing 4 gives +2 to prayer, which is really nice because it will extend your trips quite a bit as a tank. I am actually using in this setup the Zamorakian Hasta because if you didn't know, it does give additional defense bonuses. It's actually not much, but if you're tanking, your job is to soak as much damage as possible, so why not use it if you have it? You're really not there for DPS. Barrow's Gloves in the glove slot, Guardian Boots for the boots, and a Ring of Suffering imbued for +20 more defense to all defense bonus stats. Over in the inventory, we have a set of Guthans. Obviously, it is very important here. It's going to be in every setup you see in this video. Now, regardless of what setup you're using, you want to try to get as much HP back as possible so you can extend your trips as long as possible, and Guthans will help you do that. Also in this setup, we have a Saradomin Godsword for the tank, and you're going to want to use that on the minions, obviously because they have much lower defense than General Ghrazi does. The rest, you can see the potions there. The Anglerfish are for emergencies, the Hammer to get into the Bandos area, Bones to Peaches for, once again, more sustain, and a House Teleport to get yourself out. Obviously, if you have a Construction Cape or a Max Cape, you can replace that House Teleport with that. Our next setup is pretty much the exact same setup here. It's still a best in slot tank setup, but we're using the Ghrazi Rapier instead of the Zamorakian Hasta, so we are going to lose just a little bit of defense bonuses with this one. Total gear cost does go up to 1.251 billion for this, while including the Rapier, so everything else remains the same. This setup is basically if you're okay with just the Elysian and the Justiciar and not that extra DPS or that extra defense reduction from the Zamorakian Hasta, and you want to put down a little bit more DPS to help your team out. If you're a good tank, this is obviously the one to use. If you're not so good and still learning, maybe use the Hasta until you can pick it up the correct way. Our next setup is going to be our cheap tank setup, and our total gear cost here is 9.1 mil, but I am actually using a Darox plate body in this screenshot because I just happen to have one. Didn't feel like going to buy a Torax. The Darox and the Torax plate body both give the same exact defense bonuses. The Torax plate is much cheaper. It's about 800k less, so if you're using a Torax plate body here instead, your gear cost is going to drop down to about 8.3 million. So for this setup, we are using the Varrox helm, the fire cape, an Amulet of Fury, a Zamorak blessing, any of them will work, so whichever one you have, an Abyssal Tentacle, and a Crystal Shield as the offhand. If you do have a little bit more money to blow, you can switch that up for a DFS for some extra defense bonuses. Once again, the Darox plate body, Varrox plate skirt, Barrows gloves, Bandos boots, and obviously these are actually cheaper than Dragon boots and they provide better defense, so you want to go with those. And if you can't afford a Ring of Suffering, obviously you'll be using the Granite Ring, which also does give +2 defense to all the stats. If you have it imbued, it will give +4 defense to all the stats. As for the inventory, you can opt to bring a special attack weapon here, but in the essence of keeping this gear setup as cheap as possible, you're tanking, so you're trying to absorb the most damage. I would suggest bringing a Bandos Godsword if you have one or can afford one. Once again, the Guthan's armor set, because you're the tank, you want to have as much HP, so you can tank as long as possible. Super combat potions, super restores, and Ceradoma brews. Once again, the hammer to get into the Bandos area, bones to peaches, and a Hell's teleport to get yourself out. Now this tank setup, it is very cheap, but you can still see that the defense bonuses are very good. 370 to stab, 372 to slash, 356 to crush, and 413 to range. That range actually is pretty important because the Ranger minion at Bandos can hit pretty hard and pretty consistently. So overall, for a cheap setup costing somewhere between 8.3 to 9.1 mil, this is actually a pretty solid setup. So don't feel too bad if this is all you can afford, it will still get the job done. The next setups we are going to get into are going to be the DPS setups, and these are going to be your damage doers. So first up, we're going to start with the best in slot DPS setup, and our total gear cost for this one is 855.2 million, and this is going to be mostly attributed to that Scythe of Vitor. It is pretty expensive, and it does take a little bit of GP to use and charge. So as for the rest of our gear, we are going to be using the Nitsnot face guard, along with a fire cape or infernal cape if you have that, Amulet of Torture because it is the best in slot amulet for attacking, Rada's Blessing, but any of them will work if you don't have that one, Scythe of Vitor for our attacking weapon, Carol's Top, Bandos Tassets, Ferocious Gloves, Primordial Boots, and a Berserker's Ring imbued. Over in the inventory, this is our DPS setup, and it's going to remain the same for this one and the cheaper setup that we will see in just a second. Once again, Guthans, you want to sustain while you're there, make your trips last as long as possible. Bandos Godsword for your special attack option. The Dragon Warhammer does reduce by 30% all of the time, but the Bandos Godsword has a special attack accuracy multiplier, so you will want to use that as it is much more consistent to hit. You will have Divine Super Combat Potions. You want to try to stay potted as long as you can. A couple of Ceradoma Brews, a couple of Anglerfish, and some Super Restores. You'll also want a Rune Pouch to bring high-level alchemies with you, so you don't want your inventory filling up with a bunch of rune junk that you could easily just out and turn into a stack of coins. Hammer, Bones to Peaches for some more sustain, and a Teleport to House. Next up, and last but not least, is going to be our cheap DPS setup, and this one is considerably cheaper because it has not best in slot stuff in there. Total gear cost for this one is going to be 20.2 million, and we have weapon progressions at the bottom. Obviously, the Scythe of Vitor is going to be your best in slot weapon here, followed by the Ghrazi Rapier, followed by the Abyssal Tentacle, and this is where I would cut it off. I would personally not use anything less than an Abyssal Tentacle at Bandos. You do have the option to use the Abyssal Whip or the Zamorakian Hasta, but your DPS is going to suffer. The Abyssal Tentacle is not too much more of a cost than the Abyssal Whip. It does degrade over time, but it is well worth it for this boss. So my personal recommendation for you, don't do Bandos until you can afford an Abyssal Tentacle. So as for our overall cheap DPS setup, I actually did not have a Dragon Defender, so I have edited this image to add a Dragon Defender in, terribly changed the color of my Vernic Defender, and added the actual attack, defense, and other bonuses in, just so we could see the correct stats up here. But as for this gear setup, Helmet of Nitsnot, Fire Cape, Amulet of Fury, Rada's Blessing, And like I said just a minute ago, the Abyssal Tentacle will be my weapon for this one, with the Dragon Defender as the offhand. Black T-hide body, Verax plate skirt, Barrow's gloves, dragon boots, and a Berserker's ring imbued. Now, as just like with the weapon progression, if you do have better items to fill out some of these slots, obviously you want to use them. This is just a guideline to see what you should be using in which slot. As for the bonuses here, plus 250 to stab, 237 to slash, 260 to crush for the defenses, and 205 to range. Not bad overall for a DPSer at Bandos. Obviously, it could be better, but if this is what you have to work with, I promise you that it will work. Over in the inventory, our inventory is going to be identical to our best in slot setup. So that is going to wrap up this video. I have showed you a wide range of the spectrum, from best in slot all the way down to a cheap DPS setup. Now, as far as these cheap DPS setups go, this is the bare minimum that I would personally use at Bandos. There's a lot of wiggle room in between there, so if you do find that you have better gear replacements for some of these things on the cheap DPS setups, by all means, please use them. I hope you guys have liked this video. If you're looking for a Bandos solo guide, you can find one in the top right hand of the screen right now. There should be a card popping up. These DPS and tank setups are generally meant for teams of 3 to 5 people. This is not solo setup gear. So thank you guys for watching. I hope that you may have learned something, and I hope this video can get you moving in the right direction if it's going to be your first time at Bandos, or if you're just generally confused on gear. I will see you guys next time. Take it easy, everybody.